shared experiences. We're going to get talking into specific symbol sets and different ways to use them. I will be going first on runes, and my section is called Carved, Called, and Stained, Runic Work in a Ritual Space. And the reason that I call it Carved, Called, and Stained is that in the Hávamál, the sayings of the Hávamál, there are specific instructions. They're roughly the only religious instructions that we have about how to carve runes. And they're rather specific. Depending on the translation that you read, you'll get a variety of different words for this. But carved, called, and stained are kind of the three key pieces to me about how you carve runes. And I want to talk specifically about carving runes and what it means to do so, because when we discuss the empowerment of sigils, we talk about how we bring runes to life in our daily lives, the idea of carving them, calling them, and staining them. These three particular ways of looking at it and actions that we can take are good key methods for activating the work that we do. Now, in the Hávamál, this is stanza 142, 143, 144, 145, 146, depending on the translation and the original source material for that translation. This stanza moves in the numbers, but it's somewhere around there. Most commonly, it's probably either 143 or 144 or 145. But I've given you a couple of the translations, as well as the original Icelandic for this. But generally speaking, in English it goes like this: know how to cut them, know how to read them, know how to stain them, know how to prove them, know how to evoke them, know how to score them, know how to send them, know how to make the sacrifice for them. And when you're working with any set, regardless of whether it's runes or the Greek alphabet or Owen, I think that these are still useful ways of activating the magic within them, particularly the carved, called, stained. I use wood for almost all of my sets, which is why I like the word carved. You can, of course, also carve stone and a lovely variety of other things like polymer clay. This is an old set of pine runes, one of my first sets. That has been, I've been using it for a very long time, and you'll see that the lines are actually carved into the wood, and they've been stained. And what I did during the process of carving is I called out the name of each of the runes. I want to talk a little bit about each of these steps. So the idea of carving. The word is ristur in the Icelandic. I don't speak Old Norse, so I don't know if I'm actually saying that right. But fortunately, the Old Icelandic is there. You can try and figure it out for yourself if you like. But the idea behind carving is that you are making an impression into the wood, into the stone. There is something more than just you are somehow altering the material that you are putting it into. So you're doing some form of shaping, some form of changing, and that in itself is a magical act. When you think about carving runes, I tend to say that it's not just about carving into an external thing. You're also changing the shape of yourself to fit the rune in many ways. This can be entirely on a spiritual level, or if you're feeling particularly audacious and not particularly embarrassed about doing this, you can also contort your body into these shapes as well. Edward Thorson's work has images of people standing in a variety of shapes. So you've got your Fehu and your Ansus and your Nauvis. It's nifty, dance work, yoga work kind of stuff if you try and do the whole alphabet in one sitting, or one standing as the case may be. But you can add this in so that when you are doing the work, when you're doing the carving, you can pull it into yourself as well, your physical one. You can make those shapes. It gets more difficult with some of the other oracles. Not quite sure how you do a Theta, for instance, in the Greek alphabet oracle.
With a friend.
With a friend, yes. I don't know how many arms you would need to get all of the Om into place. But the runes are very well suited to this. But the idea is that when you carve into the wood and you start to get to know the wood when you do this. Oak carves differently than pine. Pine carves differently than bloodwood. It's really a very interesting experience to get to know the wood, the stone, because stones carve differently too. A quartz crystal is going to carve very differently from a piece of red jasper. There are different levels of hardness. There are inclusions that you have to consider. Hematite is different than both of those. And the act of doing that can help you to really connect with your symbol self. The second thing, talked about carving, calling, to call the runes. There is an old practice in Old Norse magic and ritual called Galdr. And Galdr is the process of chanted or spoken magic. So it's always verbal. It's always something that you say out loud. It's not something you do in your head. It's the physical act of saying the name of something. And for those of you who are good old school magicians like I am, you also have a familiarity with the concept of naming a thing. And naming a thing gives you power over that thing. So the idea here is that when you say the name, when you chant Fehu, Uruz, when you chant the names over those runes as you carve them, you are giving them names, and you are thus giving them life, and meaning, and agency. This isn't just about, this isn't creating a goal. This isn't something that you command. When I say agency, I mentioned agency as that last thing, you get it. You are giving it the ability to do its own work in the world as well. So that's the kind of magic that we talk about. When we talk about calling it, you're calling it out of the mist. The workshop, or the exercise we did just a few minutes ago, we went into the mist, we saw those symbols, doing now is you're taking those symbols that you saw in the mist, that you saw in that inner space, drawing them into the physical realm. You're calling out to them, you're carving, you're giving them a home. The third thing that's mentioned here that I find particularly important out of these, there's 8 of them that are listed. Out of these, but out of those 8, these 3 things that I find most important: the staining. Know how to stain them, how to color them. The word that we think about when we think about coloring runes is often blood. A lot of people will talk about coloring the runes with blood, and there's ample evidence in the Norse sagas that blood was used to color runes. We also know that ochre and things like that, regular paint, were also used. I don't tend to think that blood is the key ingredient. We are honoring neo-pagans, and what you do with your blood is your business. The important thing is that you color them, not necessarily what you color them with. Red is a traditional color because of the associations with blood and ochre and iron and things like that, but it's not necessarily a required thing. These particular runes that I have up here, the reason that I use them as rarely as I do in some cases is because there is a drop of my blood in the ink that was used to color those. I use regular red speedball ink, which is good and color fast and permanent. And put just a drop of my own blood in it and colored it. But the reason I think that we associate blood so heavily with the concept of staining when it comes to runes is that the staining of runes is really the hallowing of runes. And if you look at the etymology of the word to bless comes from the word for blood. And there are a lot of reasons for this. If you look back at a bloat, Old Norse blessing rite, people got covered in blood. Bloat also comes from blood, or comes from the same root that blood comes from. And so what I think that to stain them really means is you need to hallow, you need to bless your runes or your divination set before you use it. You can do that with water, you can do that with fire passing through sacred smoke, you can do that in all sorts of ways. The physical color, I think, is less important. And this is after years at this point of making sets and selling sets and making sets as gifts. I don't color any of the sets that I make anymore because, and I haven't, and this is the last set that I colored, and I colored that one, geez, probably 10 years ago, maybe longer. It's one of the first few sets that I had made. But the reason that I don't color them anymore is because that is the act, especially running a store, that a person can do on their own. And they can color the runes, they can bless or hallow them how they wish, and they can make them theirs in that way. One of the things that I like to stress to people, there are a lot of people who will stop by the shop and they'll see that we make runes and they say, well, isn't it better to make your own set? And I tell them all now the same thing, which is, it is good to make your own set. It is not necessarily better. Not everybody's spiritual path involves a wood burner, a table saw, 8 hours of sanding, give or take, mostly give, and you know the time and attention and detail that it takes to make them uniform and to get them right. Not everyone's spiritual path involves that, and that's okay. Not only is that okay, that's good. We are not all artisans. We are not all the same person. But they can buy a set from us, which we bless on our altars as well before we sell them. But the thing that they can really do to make it their own is they can, if they want to get a thing of paint and color them up, they can do that. Or if they just want to do a blessing of their own, they can. It doesn't have to be complicated to make something your own that involves runes. And that is because of my personal understanding of the idea of what it means to stain. They can be shaped by someone else, they can be calmed by somebody else. If you want to do your own thing with them, after you buy them, you can do that too. You can sand them down a little bit, you can call out their names. But the key thing is, you have to do something yourself to hallow them, to bless them. Because that is what helps to sort of induce that change in the set, and that's also what helps to induce the change in yourself. And with those things, the change in the set and the change in the self, that is how you connect with your symbol set. So when we talk about runes, and really when we talk about any sort of symbol-based divination, the act of creating the set is one that you can tie yourself to the set and tie the set to you, not necessarily by creating the whole thing, but by doing portions and pieces of the idea of carving, calling, and staining. They can be as internal or external as they need to be for you. That's the key point that I want to make on that. We change the sets and the sets change us. That said, I want to talk about crafting a set. Because I love making sets. I've been making sets non-stop for over 5 years now. We opened up the Magical Druid back in 2010, and before that I was making them just kind of on a whim, and whenever I met someone who needed a set, I'd make a set. But since it has become a commercial production for me, it has become in some ways more intimate and less intimate. I've learned a lot of good things about how to make a set, how to carve runes, and how to really make a set that sings when a person picks it up. And I've got a couple of our sets back there, various different kinds. Some of them are cut on a laser engraver, which does the job very well. With those, we typically take them over to the altar, bless those before we send them out. But we're not doing the physical carving and the physical calling in a lot of those sets. We leave that to the customer at the end. But also over there is one of our, I've got one premium set from Silkwood Artisans of Owen, and one of the premium sets from Magical Druid, which is one of our Greek alphabet oracle sets. And those we make out of one solid piece of wood. Pull them together and spend hours sanding them and cutting them just right and carving on them. And you get to know the wood intimately when you do that. You get to get a full and deep understanding of what it means to work with the spirit of that particular piece of wood, what it means to carve into it, what it smells like, what it tastes like. Because let me tell you, after 8 hours of sanding, you know what that piece of wood tastes like. And then, there are certain kinds of wood, like olive wood, for example. Olive wood really tastes and smells and feels like you've gone to Olive Garden. It's great. It is, you know, where you've poured out oil onto the fire, you can feel it surround you when the smoke comes up. The act of working, and whether you do this with wood, or you do it with stone, or regardless of what you do it with, you will find that you get that closer connection. The materials matter a lot less, I tend to think, than your ability to sort of form that connection. I've known people, I used to do some work with prison ministry, and one of the inmates that I worked with wrote to me and said, I can't get a set of runes. I don't know where to go to get them. And I said, well, can you get a deck of playing cards? And he said, yeah, I can get a deck of playing cards. So I said, well, there you're going to have a whole bunch of cards. Get a permanent marker and just write them on the backs. And then you've got your deck right there. It's like, but then it won't be made out of wood or it won't be made out of stone. I said, it doesn't matter. What matters is that you spend the time with the symbols. You get to learn them and know them. It doesn't matter if it's a nice set made out of one piece of wood or whether it's a set that's made out of 52 playing cards. That's not the important thing. The important thing is the connection that you build for yourself and that you draw yourself into. One of the things that I also want to mention about crafting a divination set, there are people who make their own divination sets, like their own symbol sets. And I find it always good to mention that I've got a rule for symbol sets. And that rule is that when you lay them out on a positive, neutral, negative, most symbol sets are roughly 50% positive, 25% indeterminate, neutral, or maybe could go both ways, and about 25% of them are negative. And this holds more or less true, and excluding nuances of negative runes or negative omens or whatever, you can kind of class them in that way. And the reason that I think it's important to mention that when you're setting up a divination set is that if you're not careful with a divination set, you can make it too positive or too negative. And depending on the kind of person you are, whether you're a pessimist or an optimist, or whether you're just trying to game the system, you're going to end up with a slightly different kind of looking process. And so we put together a crane set at one point, and we didn't follow the rules. We didn't follow that particular set of rules. And it came out okay, but it was not as explanatory as I had hoped. And we've done a couple of different kinds of things, building symbol sets and things like that, kind of thought experiments. But the 50, 25, 25 rule seems to fit real well. It fits the Greek alphabet oracle, as we like to call it, the Oracle of Doom, but it's really not. It's no more negative than any other set is. It fits the runes, it fits the omen pretty well, it fits the tarot pretty well, and it fits the Homeric oracle actually as well pretty well. So all of these sets, for the most part, kind of fit into this, all these ancient sets. And I like to hold off on the end of describing this until I tell people where I got this idea. It is the same ratio that a magic 8-ball uses. So if you are familiar with the magic 8-ball and its 20-sided dice that is in the middle of it that floats, they are roughly the same kind of there's 5 that are no or doesn't look like it kind of answers. There's 5 that are I don't know or ask again later. And then there's 10 of them that are yes or definitely or something like that. And it's very consistent. Even among the more kishy sort of newer balls, there's a pink ball that's called the magic date ball that tells you whether or not a person's going to say yes to going on the date. And so when I talk about crafting a divination set, when we get beyond the basic symbol sets and you want to create your own, that's the rule that I tend to tell people. It's the 50%, 25, 25. It will serve you very well. One of the other things that you need to learn to do is to build your own associations with the symbols. And this is particularly important when you have an ancient symbol set. A lot of people will fall into the trap of the lore says X, thus X is the only answer. If you do that, you will find yourself in a bind with a vision or a reading far more often than you find yourself happy with it. Add to that the fact that, let's be honest, if you're not taking the meanings to a new level, if you're not looking at them and saying, oh, this thing has this association in the ancient world, but in the modern world, when I see cattle, I don't think wealth, I think hammer, or whatever it is that you might think, you're going to have a difficult time reading them and internalizing them and remembering what they mean. It's important to have those personal associations as well as associations with a broader sort of ancient symbol idea. That said, it is important to read the lore and understand it. It is more important to understand that at first than it is necessarily down the line. When I read, and as an example, the rune Ansus is a good one for me. I don't typically see that as Omen, as a lot of people do, or God. I see it mostly as the mouth of the estuary, the place from which the journey begins, the door that opens to the sea from the river. I see those kinds of things, but every so often I'll look at that and there's a mention in one of the rune poems of the sword and the sheath with Ansus, and I look at that rune sometimes, and what I see is not these associations that I'm very comfortable with, but sometimes I see Yggdrasil, the world tree, because I think about that sword and that sheath, and I think the sword rides the sheath, and Odin rides Yggdrasil, sits on top of it. And so sometimes I pull that, and it's a weird association. It's a really weird association that I don't think I've ever heard anyone else have. But that kenning in that poem, and that sign, that god, it just all fits that way in my head. And every so often I'll pull it and I'll say it. So build those associations, build them based on the lore, but also based on your experience. For my funnel trick, I want to talk a little bit about creating symbols to use in your work. And there's a couple of things in particular that I want to mention. I'm going to talk about Icelandic magical staves and bind runes, which are lovely and attested, and then I'm also going to talk about things that aren't attested. So I'll start with the things that aren't. These are, and you'll see a picture of this down in the lower left-hand corner of the page of the workbook. These are Odin's eyes, and we created these based on the Fish Fiends, which Sean's going to talk about in his discussion. But the Fish Fiend worked really well for us, and it's an Irish type of Omen that is in concentric circles and has each of the Omen on it. It's further in the book as well, you'll see a little bit. But actually, I'm here. But each of the Omen is on it, and we found that it was so damn good for visualization and trance work and things like that. We needed something on the north side, because I don't work a lot with Omen, though this almost convinced me that I really needed to. But I work a lot with the runes. And so as I was delving into the concept of the Fish Fiend, or the Finn's Window, I came up with this visionary idea in my own head about Odin's Eye, and the Valk nut in the center, and the concentric rings outside, and how Odin takes his eye and casts it into the well of Mimir. And one of the things that we did with this, with the Fish Fiend, is we used it in trance, holding it up to our eye, and as we trance, and the vision of looking through it was something that was impressive to me and useful to me. And so when we created this, we put a hole in the middle of it as well. It's a little bit bigger than our smallest Fish Fiend, because the hole is way smaller. But when we put it together, I thought about it, and just as the Finn's Window is a view of the cosmos through the top of the smoke hole of the Iron Age house, this is a view of the cosmos from the center of that well of memory, from which, or into which Odin has cast his eye, and the ripples that flow out from it, the concentric circles that carry the runes and the wisdom of the kindreds. That's the kind of sign, the kind of symbol that sort of we developed based on the symbol set. Another thing that we put together is a rune board. And this, I've only got one piece, so we can pass this around, but it's loosely based on the concept of 9 worlds. So you'll recognize a couple of the 9 worlds on there, but it's not entirely based on that. But it is 9 positions on the world tree. And each of those positions, when you lay runes out on it, and the nice thing about making our own stuff in Magical Runes is that I can make stuff that fits together really well, so that fits over really nice rune sets perfectly. They just sit right in there. But when you lay them out, what I've learned, because I came up with the design first, and then I started messing around with it. And what I ended up with was, in these layers of 9, a past, present, future that goes this way, and an inner to outer view of the world. So down in the lower left-hand corner, you have what's in the past and what is hidden inside. And in the upper right-hand corner, you have what is in the future and what is external to you. And you can read it in a variety of different ways. When I do a really in-depth reading, I'll read it this way, I'll read it this way, I'll read it with diagonals, and it just flows very nicely. And I highly recommend that as you get practice with your symbol set, that you develop your own reading style and your own spreads, because the way that you interact with the runes or any of the symbol sets will be unique to you, and will be something that you really drive yourself. And we like to talk about external influences and being able to sort of do an external check on what the seer is seeing in ritual. But I have this deep tendency to trust my seer. And what the seer says is what is actually the message that comes from the spirits. Even if the seer reads it wrong in ritual, the seer is right. And we can talk about it afterwards if there's a symbol set and someone read Feu as Anzus or Anzus as Feu or got something mixed up. That's okay. It's not a problem, because after the ritual we can talk about how Feu fits instead of Anzus, but what the seer said ritual is still right. So feel free to develop your own method, even if it can't be cross-checked or figured out, but I think that it's important that we spend some time as seers doing that kind of work, developing our own spreads and then sharing those spreads with others, so we can do that kind of checking. The last thing I want to talk about, and this gets kind of to the talisman creation piece that we're going to do later. Bind runes and Icelandic staves. Bind runes are, I suppose, the simpler of the two. The idea there is that you're taking two runes and or more, and you're smushing them together in a way that you can still see those runes in the binding. They might be changed a little bit, they might be a little bit different, but you can clearly recognize, hey, there's a Berkano, there's a Hávamál, that is the bind rune for Arrow Bluetooth, which is the bind rune that we all see for Bluetooth. Very clear. And what you're doing there is you're taking a set of runes and combining their influences and their meanings, hopefully in an educated and intelligent manner, so that they can play off of each other and help you in the work that you're doing with both of those influences. Icelandic staves are a little bit different, and I have a couple here that I put together, and I'm just going to open these and pass them around. This particular stave is an Icelandic fear spell, and it is designed to cast fear into your enemies. And what you do, and the whole spell, as it's written in the whole manuscript, is actually on the card there. But what you do is you carve it onto a piece of oak, and you hang it around your neck, and you see your enemy before he sees you, and it will strike fear into his heart. And that is the entirety of the spell. And so, what I want to really show with these is that the Icelandic staves tend to be based on, in many cases, runic symbols in some way, shape, or form. The Hávamál is a key example. It looks like a bunch of obvious staves. You can see them, but they've been put into a circle, and there's crossbars on them, there's all sorts of different things like that. But you can still see them. And then you look at this, and there are clearly rune shapes in this, but they don't look quite as runic as they might in a bind rune. And in a lot of ways, the Dangler and the work that goes into creating an Icelandic stave, and the whole class of Icelandic staves, but changes it and shapes it into a different and more, or I guess actually less iconographic sign that gives you an idea of what it's supposed to do. And it's more likely to be a hidden idea than some of the other kinds of bind runes. It's harder to pull the rune out of it. If you're really interested in sigils and the ways that they look, this is one of Ian Corrigan's vision talismans. I'll pass this around as well. What he's done there is he's created an eye in the center of the trilithon, and around it there are signs that were actually created using one of the fish fiends. So since each of these are letters, he can take a spirit name and he can go from letter to letter to draw out a sigil on this. Same thing with the Omens eye, you can do it there too. But that's how he gets the odd sigils around the edges. And as you get deeper and more into the concepts of Western magic, you start to find that things get more and more abstract. They move on to, you know, sacred letter number boxes and a variety of different kinds of pentacles and all sorts of cool stuff. And Western magic moves further and further and further away from heavily runic sigils or heavily alphabetical sigils of any alphabet. But the act is of combining them and of doing the carving and the calling and the staining that we talked about earlier. When you carve one of these things, one of these Icelandic staves, pulling out the runes that you're using and calling to them, pushing them into the stave, and then hallowing them in some way, whether that be with blood or blessing. Pushing them back into that stave, hallowing them, will give you the activation that you really need to do to make these things work.